So Atlantis, the question really comes down to, was it exclusively a contrivance of Plato, or was there some historical authenticity to the idea? And there's basically two schools of thought on that. One is that, and has been the predominant point of view in most academic circles for many decades, and that is that it was a metaphor. Plato invented this metaphor to give some form to his concept of the idealized civic structure, the idealized society, the way he envisioned it. So that was pretty much the dominant academic view, but then there were those who deviated from it and said, no, behind that legend, there is some authentic reality, some history that actually happened. In Plato's dialogues, he mentions the chronology of Atlantis and the 10 kings and the demise of Atlantis after this great war between the imperialistic Atlanteans and the proto-Hellenic defenders of the Mediterranean area. And after this tremendous battle, tremendous war, which is placed at 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile in Egypt, which, given that that's roughly 600 BC, give or take a few decades, puts us right at about 11,600 years ago, or 9,600 BC. And which is interesting these days, because if you follow the whole question of the Younger Dryas, the transition from glacial to interglacial age, from Pleistocene to Holocene, you know that the termination of the Younger Dryas, the catastrophic termination of the Younger Dryas, climatic anomaly or excursion, whatever you want to call it, catastrophe, the end of that, the termination, is dated at about 11,600 years ago. You like this map?
Yep.
I do. I love this map. Okay, so what we have right here is the Straits of Gibraltar, flanked by the pillars.
Okay, that's what I thought, yeah.
That's the Pillars of Heracles, which mark the gateway between the Atlantic over here to the west, the Mediterranean over here to the east. And there were actually islands in here that are now sunk.
Wow.
Yes. So anybody sailing west through here would have come to islands. Now let's go to this next. Let's see. Well, yeah. So right here, here's from Plato himself. And there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands. And from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent.
Wow.
Which surrounds the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is the real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent.
Wow.
Yeah, right there. Let's look at this next slide here. Let me back up right here. When we look at this one, Strait of Gibraltar, but take a look at this one.
Oh, yeah. So is that the Azores up in the top there that's actually poking out a little bit?
Yes, the Azores is this cluster of islands that are actually part of a whole microcontinent.
So you could picture basically all that sort of light blue being above the water.
This light where Kurt, can you see my cursor? Yeah. That's the Azores Plateau.
Wow.
And here's the Pillars of Heracles, and all in here are a group of sunken islands. So
and then they jumped from those to the middle ones, and then they're saying you can get over to the other continent from there.
Yes. There it is. I mean, right there. That's what I'm talking about. The geography checks out. Here's the Azores Plateau.
Oh.
You could picture that all of the orange would have been above water.
Wow. So how deep is that now then? That's because you think it's sunk. It's like 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet in that area? Or
yeah, the peaks of these mountains are sticking above the waves, and that's the islands of the Azores, are the peaks of these sunken mountains.
Yeah.
And they are sunken mountains, yes. That's not some pseudoscience. But one thing is certain, you certainly would have had the 400-foot change in sea level. which means that there are islands now that are totally submerged that could have been above the sea level, and islands that are now above sea level would have been much more extensive when you drop sea level 400 feet.
What about in the Mediterranean then? How did that rise of 400 feet affect the Mediterranean? And does that map that you looked at show anything around Santorini, or is there anything in the Mediterranean that could also be Atlantis?
Well, if again, taking Plato at face value, Atlantis had colonies, and it had outlying, trade networks, which clearly implied we're in the Mediterranean.
Right, right.
So that's how I tend to interpret it. And also, when you begin to look at mythology of the Western Hemisphere, there's plenty of stuff in there that could be consistent with a migration from the East.
Yeah.
Now if you want to just hypothesize that there was a civilization that rose up on these islands during the Ice Age, the first sea level pulse may have begun a process of destabilization. In fact, what Plato describes is how, the Atlantean kingdom went from being this virtuous and, beneficent place to being corrupted with power and imperial ambitions. And this is what led them to try to come in and subjugate the cultures within the Mediterranean that led to the big war. Largely, the coastlines of the world roughly coincided with
that line.
Right. Although not always, because like I said, there was sometimes this drop off was like 1,000 feet deep. So it would have still been under 400 or 500, 600 feet of seawater.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, the continental shelves, the continental shorelines were much further seaward during the Ice Age than they are now.
North and South America might have been connected more through the Central America.
Well, watch this now. I'm gonna toggle between this map and the next one that shows sea level, I think 350 feet low. So it's a very conservative, but you'll still be able to get a sense of. I particularly look up here.
Okay. Yeah.
Right up there by Alaska, and look.
Yeah, you got to focus on one area. Wow. Yeah, you got to focus on one area when you toggle back and forth. So do that again a couple times.
And Greenland too.
Yeah, well, what we'll do.
Oh, it looks like it's connected right there between South and North America down the Baja.
It's pretty darn close. Now watch. We're going to take a closer look at North America. Okay, so here's the present coastlines. Now watch this.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it connects up north even.
Yeah, and the problem is that there's been a huge hijacking of the science, and it's emphasizing only one interpretation of the science to the neglect of other interpretations. And the narrative now is that human beings are pretty much the sole cause of climate change. And that is about as far from the truth as you could possibly get. We have tons of evidence.
So where can people go if they want to? You mentioned you did a full deep dive on Atlantis. If our viewers want to go and decide they want to go enjoy that, where can they find that?
At cosmographia.com. Just go to randallcarlson.com. It's the podcast that we do. We're up to about 60 episodes now. The first 5, I'm pretty sure it was 5, are devoted to the whole in-depth discussion of Atlantis.
Wow, that's fantastic. So is that also on video or is it mainly audio?
No, it's video as well.
One of the things about ancient Egypt that people don't often realize is that our orthodox version of their civilization is not at all what they said their civilization was. They trace their roots back far further than, the beginning of the Old Kingdom, at like 3000 BC. Like the Egyptians called themselves a legacy civilization of the people that came before. So he has that perspective as well, Yusuf's, but he's epic. And anyone, I'd highly recommend him. A couple other guys like him as well in Egypt, but you can go there and get a real authentic. And I think it would really help Egypt because the more mystery and wonder you can inject into these things, the more people are going to want to go and see it. And I think there's a lot of that to be found there. There's, I think, less if you just, we know how this was done. The Egyptians built it all. They built the pyramid in 25 years, and it was done. But everyone came and worked on it for 3 months a year or whatever. We know how it was done. But the deeper you look, there's so many unanswered questions and so many aspects of this that haven't been studied appropriately yet. That they're not things that the establishment and I guess academia that have the permits and they control the access for research seem to be very interested in chasing down. But there are people out there that are doing it, and including guys in Egypt like Yusuf. There's an interesting correlation with things like the amount of underground cities, almost like Derinkuyu in Turkey, Cappadocia. There's underneath the ground at Saqqara in Egypt. People don't realize just how much is beneath the ground there, and there was quite likely a reason why people were down in the ground. Like Derinkuyu, I think in Turkey's something like 250,000 people could have lived down in these caverns.
Wow!
And it's why are you living down there? Like, what? It's not a defensive measure. Like, you can put water in there and you can seal. Like, it's not a good place to go if you're worried about people invading you. But it is a good place to go if the surface is going to kill you, which we know has now happened. Like, things like the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. There's been solar events. There may have been a strong reason why people may have had to go underground for generations, and we might be looking at some of the evidence for that in these places. I think there's a strong possibility of that. Like places like Saqqara in Egypt, which is where the Step Pyramid is, where they think that it was like that's the first pyramid that came up. There's such a deeper level of sophistication beneath the ground than what's above it. This is a video that I'm working on at the moment. And there's something like at least 5 or 6 miles of tunnels beneath Saqqara. We don't really know how much the underground, how far it goes. And even Orthodox academics admit that there's the vast majority of ancient Egypt is beneath the ground. It's still beneath.
Wow.
So it's just all buried in sand?
Not just buried in sand, but in the bedrock. It's probably the most famous of these great Egyptian structures that has been lost to the sands of time. And it's one that we know about because we had guys like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus and all of these historical figures were writing about it. They witnessed it. So you have Egyptian records of it. Then you also have these other records that come from other civilizations that sort of verify this existed. And this was something incredible. It was like thousands of rooms. It was the biggest, one of the biggest underground, like talk about it like 7 or 8 football fields, like massive multi-leveled underground labyrinth that is, you were said to have needed a guide to go through there. It was multi-levels. It was all granite, like massive granite walls. There's a lot of descriptions of it. It's an incredible structure, lost to the sands of time, apparently. And Flinders Petrie, I consider him one of the pioneering archaeologists and Egyptologists that he was the first guy to really apply modern engineering techniques to try and find stuff. And he speculated that this was located at Hawara, which is there's a pyramid, like a mud brick pyramid. There's a big sands. It's just a pyramid, like a broken down mud brick pyramid with all of this sand there today. But he dug down the sand. He found big granite blocks, and he suspected that was the foundations of the labyrinth. Now, what later happened? There was an expedition called the Matterhorn expedition. I think it was 2015, if I'm not wrong. That was done in coordination with this the Supreme Council, Antiquities, under Hawass at the time, and they went and did a bunch of ground penetrating, like 4 or 5 different techniques to look under the ground, and they found the damn thing. Like Petrie didn't find the foundations for it. He found the roof for it. He found the top layer. And what they found was that far below that, there's all these images you can see of it, like a grid pattern of all of these blocks. And it's this massive, everywhere they scanned, they found evidence for this labyrinth. And the funny thing about all this is that it really matches up with almost every ancient culture, our culture included. It matches up with our stories, religions, traditions, everything we say about our past. Even in the Christian culture today, it's like flood myths, fire myths. You can't poke a stick at any ancient religion without finding either flood or fire or some massive cataclysm that their ancestors barely survived and then had to rebuild. They were knocked back down and had to come back up again. And this holds true for Egypt, for Native American traditions, for our tradition, for that matter. So it's all these things kind of line up. And then, we've at the same time been discovering that, our species gets older and older and older. We keep finding older and older and older examples of Homo sapiens. We find more and more complexity in our DNA. Like we now know that there's some link between South American cultures and Australasian cultures that doesn't exist in Central and North American cultures or back in the day. So it really challenges the whole, well, if the people came into the Americas through that northern land bridge, how come those people in Northern and Central America don't have this genetic indicator? There's so much to talk about with these phases, and this gets down into sort of the engineering challenges of creating objects like these. And again, these are all made. So there's tens of thousands of these, 50,000 or more.
Wow.
40,000. Oh, they're everywhere. The 40,000 or more of these were discovered beneath the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, in those 6 miles of tunnels that I was talking about.
Holy shit.
And not only there, but also like the schist disc, which we can take a look at too. That's supposedly first dynasty. You have other objects like this that are admittedly pre-dynastic, so they're even older. I think a lot of these were inherited and reused, and there's some evidence for it. But just from an engineering perspective, they're utterly remarkable. And part of this is based on the material that they're made from. So a lot of these are made from granite, schist, diorite, even corundum. So stuff that's like 6.5, 7, 8, even 9 on the Mohs scale of hardness, which tops out at 10 with a diamond, which, some of this stone is incredibly difficult to work. This was a saw cut. This was a saw. See the curve to the blade? This was a saw cut that wasn't quite finished on this basalt block. A massive circular saw cut. This is at a place called Abu Sir. That's an Old Kingdom site. It's not somewhere that the general public can get to, but you can see the striations from the blade. You can also see the curve of the blade. This would have been a circular saw, perhaps a swing saw that was like probably 9 meters or so in diameter. I did a video recently about this box in Lahoon. This is a granite box carved from a single piece, not as big as the boxes in the Serapeum, but this is probably the most precisely made granite box that we've ever found in Egypt, in a granite room, by the way. This is all made from granite. And this thing has tolerances down to the thousandths of an inch, as measured by Flinders Petrie. And again, he was the first guy to apply these engineering principles and try to understand how things were made. It's, I think, a discipline that's sorely lacking from today's orthodox establishment. It's an incredible, this place, there's 24 of these boxes, and there's some of them weigh 50, 60, 70, even up to 100 tons with the lid.
What are the dimensions of them approximately?
It's sort of probably, some of them are up like 15 feet long, and probably some of them are even longer. Some of them are up to 10 or 11 feet high with the lid.
Oh, so like that one we're looking right now, that's like 6 feet across or so, would you say?
At least, yeah.
At least.
There's a good, I think there's a clip of me. Where
Wow, so those are absolutely massive, and there's a lot of them down there.
It's 20, and we've never replicated one of the. We it's funny. Chris Dunn did the experiment. He went and asked granite companies can you make one of these? Because again, the part that people forget about this, it's single piece of stone, single piece. Both the lid and the box come from a single piece of stone, and you're carving it from a single piece of stone. Last year, and he actually went and took a modern surface roughness meter that measures sort of the flatness of surfaces down to the microns, and he laser scanned a bunch of these objects and things in India, and really got some tremendous results. And I think it really puts this idea that some of these objects and structures were made by hand to rest, because he's taken measurements, particularly in some of these caves in India, but also on the H blocks at Pumapunku, the boxes in the Serapeum. You're talking about single digits of microns in terms of flatness. And one of the walls in this cave has a surface roughness of around 1.5 microns. Now, a micron being 1,000th of a millimeter. Like, that's how flat this surface is, and over long distances. Like, this is absolutely mind-boggling. And
what
clearly
does
something else other than guys rubbing on it with rocks and sand was involved here. And the implications on history are staggering. Not just history, but technology as well, I think. So there's a lot more we should be doing to study this stuff, is what I'm saying, I think. And some of those answers may lay outside of our current realm of understanding.
I'm wondering what like the high end finish for concrete is these days. Like how smooth can they get concrete, or even a sheet of glass isn't going to be close to that.
Well, no, a sheet of glass itself, you're at the almost this you are at the same rugosity or surface roughness of glass at that point. Yeah, you are. That's about the same as just glass, which it uses gravity. It settles on a level. It's like that's perfectly formed glass. It is orders of magnitude smoother than precision concrete. In the Serapeum specifically, in these alcoves with these boxes, and I think this is something else that sort of hints at a functional nature, there were these massive granite false doors. So these big pieces of granite, and they had this, what's called a false door shape on it. You'll see it at the back of this box. And all of that granite, you can see it. There was one of them, like they were facing the boxes. In all the alcoves, you had on either side these big false doors, which I think are acoustically active devices. There's a few resonance chambers that use that shape that you can still experience some astonishing.
In this particular family that he starts, he creates 10 demigod kings. And demigod, in its ancient understanding, is the offspring of a god and a human female. Just like the Genesis 6 story has the sons of God and the daughters of Cain, producing the Nephilim, or the giants, as it's recorded in the King James Version Bible, with giants going back to the word Nephil, and I am for the male plural. So these demigod kings were described as Atlanteans who had blonde hair and blue eyes and sharp aquiline or hooked noses. They had high cheekbones, their eyes glowed, they had long necks, they were serpentine looking because they looked just like the Watchers who created them. Again, just to show people that this is a global historical reckoning of what happened in prehistory that always includes giants. And we just need to understand that fact. So if you go into Genesis 6 now, 6:1 through 4 is where the giants are created before the flood. That's the preamble to the flood story. So what happens in Genesis 6, you get the creation of the giants, and you get the Noah's commission because of what the giants are doing, and then you get the flood, all in chapter 6, and then 7 and 8 and 9 are going to cover the flood and shortly thereafter. So it is the start of the flood story. There's nothing to separate it. And in all accounts around the world, it's the giants that are causing the gods in the polytheist perspective to destroy the earth because of the destruction and the horrible things that the giants are doing. I think both are controlling the information for their own power reasons. And those are the two biggest sources, not the Smithsonian. That's a branch of the Royal Society and the Freemasons. Understand the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians established the Royal Society, and then the money, James Smithson, who was a Rosicrucian and a Royal Society member, funded the Smithsonian to be created with his will. So if you look at the Windsor family, and this is just on some things that they have said, and also what we know about the dynasty that they're going to connect back to. Prince Charles and Elizabeth, but mostly Prince Charles, had said he has genealogies that takes him back to Vlad the Impaler. Yeah. Right? Which is kind of spooky, but that's a different story. And he was a red-haired, hazel-eyed, pale-skinned, Tuatha De Danann descendant from Scythia that they take their genealogies back to.
So all these different mythologies and cultures have their version of giants, I guess. Like there's the Nephilim and the Anunnaki, the Titans, and all the ones that you mentioned. There's the Chinese ones and the Egyptian ones and the South American ones. I mean, they've all got their version of this.
They do. Yeah. So like you have the Myosi in China, or you have the Datria, the Azuras, and several other names in India. You have the Xibalba in the Kishamaya. All around the world, you have an accounting of these giants, the Tengu in Southeast Asia and into Japan. So there's many, many different names for them. And the Xibalba were and the Tengu, they were a bird-like looking Nephilim and priests, because they usually produced a priest class and a warrior ruling class. And that comes from the Anunnaki, I think, and or a Horus type of god. It's all talking about bringing what they would call the 1,000 points of light together. So that's the famous buzzwords that both Senior and Junior of the Bush family talked about in several speeches, including at Senior's funeral by Junior. And the 1,000 points of light is a reference to the spark of the divine. And the 1,000 points of light was used in the New World Order speech by President Bush Sr. In the 90s when it first sort of came out. Well, there's a link, and if people can't find it, they can get a hold of me. I can send it to you. It's a link where it has old newspaper writings.
Right.
That I was talking about earlier, starting in about the 1850s. Yeah. And again, all of those findings, they go to the universities and then to the Smithsonian or right to the Smithsonian, and they just kind of disappear. I think from a contemporary basis, those are the best ones to look at, and then look into the Peruvian skulls.
Right.
Yeah, and can I just touch on a few names out of the Bible that are giants?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is like the who's who of giants.
People are familiar with the name Nephilim. I also talk about Rephaim. So Nephilim only shows up 3 times for giant in the King James Version Bible. All the other 25 times it goes back to Rephaim. The Rephaim are the post-Diluvian giants. Now, you've got other names that are shown that are giants, which are Anak, or the Anakim. And you've got the Emin, and you've got the Zuzim that I mentioned earlier, the Amalekim, the Horim, the Zamzuzim, the Avim, the Hivim, and the Horim. And there are more yet. You have the Caphtorim, you have the Perazim, I think you have the Kenim and the Kenazim that I mentioned earlier, and you also have the Caphtorites, the Caphtorim as well, and the Chetharim that are mentioned. And that's the main ones that you're going to see talked about in the Bible, but they don't always say they're giants.
So, I mean, at this point, I think we're at the point, where there's enough questions that we can start getting actual boots on the ground and getting people to hopefully get out there, learn more about this, go to your own area where you live, because a lot of this research, you'd be surprised. A lot of weird historical inaccuracies you can find in your own hometown or the town you live in. And that's a great place to start. And then you get into communication with other people and they start connecting the dots. And then next thing you know, we're one step closer. What the mainstream says is Tartaria was a loose association of nomadic tribes that all banded together and kind of had this agreement, I guess. It wasn't really, they say it wasn't really a government. It didn't really have a leader. It was just, the steppes, which, is central, basically from the Black Sea, Balkan area, all the way through to Siberia, essentially. So one of the largest, if not the largest, continuous landmass on the planet was inhabited by, according to the mainstream, just a bunch of dudes on horses drinking milk.
One of the unique things you can find about North America is the United States of America claims that aside from teepees, no one was here first. We were here first. And that's a narrative that has constantly been shown to be false.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples of this. Oh, here's the one I was talking about. So you have Russian Tartary, Siberia up here in the north. Then you have an independent Tartary here in the center. And to the east, you have Chinese Tartary. So 3 pretty distinct. And you can see here the rest of the countries are filled out. And, all of these countries have flags. They have leaders. I mean, Persia, Arabia, all these places are distinct civilizations. So to say that they're just this loosely associated group of
nomads,
Mongols is ridiculous. It's not. there's no precedent for it. And the major issue is that there's plenty of evidence of this. You can go and you find books previous to like 1850. There are books that are discussing Tartary as if it is a civilization, as if they're a race of people.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing crazy in there. I mean, let's put it this way. We're not talking about
Atlantis.
Free energy, flying around, everything was amazing, utopia, steampunk Tartary here. I just want to make that clear to everyone that there is a distinction in this research where people are very quick to jump straight to, okay, they were a civilization, they were wiped off the map, because they were. I mean, they were literally wiped off the map. Like, there are just no maps depicting Tartary anymore. They were literally wiped off the map. So obviously they were a utopian, perfect, free energy civilization that had everything figured out, and we killed all of them. The first event happened sometime around there, because that's when the forging of historical relics really took off. That's when all of these monks were in their monasteries and their abbeys getting paid to crank out pagan manuscripts, just like Roman, like they're taking Plato. Like here, okay, so here you have 1500s, you're in France, you're a young and upcoming monk, and the way you make money for your abbey is you sit around all day and you hand copy onto pieces of cowskin a pagan document written by a Roman historian from 1500 years ago that is based off of a few fragments, maybe. I don't know what they actually had. We've never seen the primary sources of a lot of where these manuscripts come from. And you have that explode in the beginning of the 1500s, or late 1400s, early 1500s. So there was an attempt to flood the zone, if you will, with forged or, repurposed, manuscripted history.
If we can piece together this block of history wherein we might have seen travel through these regions, it would force a rewrite of that block of history, even a bit, because you guys, I'm sure you're familiar with the old idea that the oceans are barriers, when in fact, thanks to recent research and points and even a couple books and live tests, the four Scotsmen made a rawhide boat and came to America in it in 4 days. The oceans are highways. And so for that to not be true of the ancient world, there's a hidden connection there.
But boats would obviously be the superior way of transportation. And I believe that they did send a large group of these warriors, these Mongols, whatever you want to call them, the Golden Horde type people. They went to America and they landed in the Pacific Northwest and in, where, Canada and Alaska and all those areas, and really I think concentrated in San Francisco, and where San Francisco and Seattle are now. So we have a region on maps called Fusang. This is what some have called a Chinese settlement that has existed from about 500 AD on, and there are multiple maps that show Fusang as a settlement, obviously sounding very Chinese. It says right here, Chinese colony. This is, where is this? This would be, I think would be Seattle would be, right? Approximately.
In the Puget Sound kind of thing up there?
You'd have to zoom out, but yeah.
There's an even larger, here it is, pretty big, pretty well
Vancouver.
labeled. Yeah. Pretty well labeled on the map. It's not a small area.
So the Wiggers, and I'll say it properly because I'm not afraid. The Wiggers were very loosely associated with the Khan. All through history, you can read the biggest books by the biggest names of the day. It was a 12th century missive sent to the Khan so that he didn't march his horde down through China, and the Uyghurs delivered the messages. They were the emissaries.
Wow.
As local peoples. And the Khan liked the symbols on the seal and pendant and on the letters so much, he made the Uyghurs teach it to his people. And so this is the origin of the Mongolian language. So until very, very recently, and from the outset, you could say the Uyghurs have been a prominent feature in the entire idea of Tartaria.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a very, very large statue. And you can see it's also built on a sort of pyramid.
Oh, yeah, right.
So this is a very unique...
look at how large that is.
Where is this?
Volgograd.
This is Mamayev Kurvan. So this is a battle memorial for the Battle of Volgograd, or for, I believe it's St. Petersburg.
Is that sword like 200 feet long? How long is the sword?
It's huge. It is ridiculously huge.
Well, look at the people on the path over there. They don't even match the base of the thing.
Right.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. The sword's got to be close to 100 feet.
There's a book that I found called The Young Folks' History of Russia. And this was written in 1881. And it's just like it's basically a storybook for kids, or like a basic history kind of book. And it tells the story of Mamai Khan. So Mamai Khan was a general in the Golden Horde army. He fought against the Christians in 1380. But the Mamai Khan was, in this story, standing on an ancient burial ground in this area, because Mamayev Kurgan is the name of this area. It is based off Mamayev Kurgan. As we said, Kurgan was the burial mound. So Mamayev Kurgan means the kurgan of Mamayev, right? So that's the name of this hill that they fought this battle on. That hill is where that statue is now. So they built the motherland statue on top of the kurgan of Mamai.
Wow.
It is the finest example locally of iconoclasm. We're going to build our monument on top of your monument.
Because in the wake of a natural disaster, you can go in and you can rewrite history. And then you have, of course, the conflicts of the Civil War in the United States. You also have, at the same time, the Crimean War between the French and the Russians. You have many global conflicts that lead up until, World War I, World War II. So that's the second stage. That's also the rise of the oligarchs and the oil oligarchs and the bankers and basically the people that created this current society. That previous, 100 years of cataclysm and strife and destruction and repurposing led to these people showing up and creating the new society through the World's Fairs and the expositions and these massive displays of out with the old, in with the new.
The version of history we were taught was basically that civilization spread from the south to the north, that it all started somewhere around the region that is now Iraq. And then it went via the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans and further north until all of Europe was civilized. So the early inhabitants of Northern Europe tended to be written off as primitive barbarians. And I remember virtually the only thing I remember being taught about the ancient Britons was that they used to dye their skins blue with a substance called woad. So I used to imagine these mysterious blue-skinned figures moving through the misty forests of ancient Britain and occasionally grunting to each other in some primitive language. Well, we now know that that picture is completely false, that there was, in fact, a highly advanced civilization in the north long before the Romans came, long before the pyramids were even built. The idea of Hyperborea or Tula or Thula, as it's sometimes called, goes back to ancient Greece, to about the 4th century BC, when a Greek mariner called Pythias sailed from the port of Massalia, which is present-day Marseille, in a ship that probably looked something like this. And he sailed out through the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, and out into the Atlantic and up into the far north. And he came to a land which he described as a land of fog and ice, which may have been Iceland. We don't know exactly where it was. It could possibly have been Iceland. But he called this land Tula, or Thula, or Ultima Thula, as the Romans called it. And this merged with the legend of Hyperborea. The name Hyperborea, it means literally beyond the north wind, Boreas being the god of the north wind. And later on, just a few years ago, there was another expedition which went there, and they found all sorts of very interesting things, like pyramids, like this one here.
I'm glad you're sharing these slides, because reading your book, it's very interesting to hear that they're actually finding some stuff like that in
pyramids. Even.
Yeah. So things like this and labyrinths. Now,
Wow.
Labyrinths are very interesting because you find labyrinths like this all over the Northern Hemisphere, and in fact, right down into the territories of the Native Americans. All the indigenous peoples around the Arctic Circle, from the Inuit in Greenland around to Alaska, and the various Mongol people of Siberia, the Yakut and the Buryat and so on, and the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, they all have shamanic cultures.
Yeah.
And as you say, Barchenko investigated the Sami, and there was one particular island in the Kol Peninsula where they had a burial ground which was sacred. It was covered with reindeer skulls. The reindeer being a sacred animal in that part of the world. And he came to the conclusion that the Sami were practicing a very ancient sun cult, and that, in fact, they were the original Hyperboreans. Well, now this is very fascinating. These are some petroglyphs, as they call stone spheres. They're about the size of a tennis ball, and they are about 2,000 years old. And the interesting thing about them is that these markings, these sort of protuberances on them, correspond to the Platonic solids, the 5 Platonic solids, which you see below on the right, where the Stonehenge is on the left.
Yeah. Stonehenge
is a solar monument, whereas Callanish Stones is lunar. It was all like, it's like a kind of observatory geared to the cycles of the moon. There are many Russians who would like to see the Russians as the descendants of the Hyperboreans. One artist, Alexander Uglanov. So this is one of his images of the way he imagined Hyperborea. So, as you can see, he imagined it as a very technically very advanced culture with spaceships and other forms of aircraft and these fantastic buildings. The Nordic mythology says that the ruins were revealed to Odin, the god Odin, as he hung on the world tree, the Yggdrasil, for 9 days and nights. So it was a kind of shamanic ordeal. One is the level of actual historical fact, and the other is the level of myth and legend. And I think there is a sort of a, you could call it an archetype. It's a motif that you find again and again throughout history, namely the motif of the faraway Never Never Land, the faraway promised land, which is almost unreachable, but not quite. It's reachable by those who are have reached the necessary stage of development.
But we have the Pan American Buffalo Exposition of 1901. So here we have, this is the Temple of Music. So these structures, we are told, are temporary. In 18 months, they constructed, yes, in 18 months, they constructed this city. It took them 18 months to build, and there are several structures that they claim are temporary that still stand. So we have an entire civilization and generation of people with master level craftsmanship that have been removed from this society. They have been killed, they've been exterminated, they were sent through 2 world wars to ensure that nobody would have the ability to make these things ever again. You work in construction, or relatively speaking, what kind of logistics would it take just to build one of these temporarily? Yeah, I like to call it the grand unified architecture. I prefer that as a phrase because it stays agnostic of a particular civilization, because I don't think we know who the civilization is necessarily. So, and I don't think it's Roman. They call it Greco-Roman architecture. I don't like that phrase either. I like grand unified architecture. So you can see again this signature brick here. So you have the archways, you have the brick laid out very well, and you can see all kinds of evidence of an entire layer of civilization underneath Rome. We're talking tunnels. We're talking, what are these? Sewer systems could have been a way of transporting energy. Could have been, these could have been railroads back then. I don't know. But there are, I don't know how long it took them to excavate this stuff, and this is a massive amount of material. And
so those statues were underneath there too.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's the big change up in popular culture. They always have, and in video games too, not just movies and TV. They talk about the sewers beneath Rome, the catacombs. They said that they couldn't find Pompeii until 1631, but Pompeii is openly on maps in the very same location with Herculaneum and other cities all through the 1500s. So there's less than 100-year split between when it was put on maps and when it was
apparently found,
dug out.
Yeah, because they didn't know it was there. Apparently, that's what they're claiming.
They say that for 1,600 years they couldn't find the thing.
Yeah.
But every map maker had found it and had been right about it up until the day they dug it out.
But it turns out that they're all a bunch of rich kids from ancient bloodlines from like Dutch families and German families that are responsible for the repurposing of our history. And so I think what we're looking at is we have these repurposed structures. They give these spooks the title of architect, and they're the ones that are responsible for the retrofitting of these structures. They are not the progenitors. They are not the designers of these structures. They are the inheritors. That's why all these cities are founded and not built. You ever wonder about that? The wordplay?
Founded, not constructed.
Penn Station's huge. I wonder if some of these structures weren't used as airships, some sort of airship-based.
Like an airport?
Airport.
Yeah.
You see a lot of the designs of these train stations. They do look like a airship could be flown through them or kept in them. If you just bust out one of the walls, they have that sort of half cylindrical design to them that kind of makes them look like hangars in a lot of situations. You find a lot of that style of structure in that period of time, is those sort of huge, cavernous, half cylindrical, hangar looking structures in major cities. And then you have the large spires, like at the top of the Empire State Building, that was used as refueling stations for airships. There has been a complete rewriting of our history that has been done in our relative generation. We know people who have gone through it. I have had great uncles who went through the insane asylum, mental asylum, reprogramming prisons that they had set up for 100 years in the 18 and 1900s. So from a personal level, I am very interested in knowing why this happened and a little bit of what happened. I don't think we're ever going to get down to it. And that's the other part of it that's fun, is that it never stops. So you can just keep going and going and going and going. We didn't even talk about Star Force. This is the first we're mentioning it in the last 5 minutes. It's like, how do we even forget it? Good Lord. I mean, I could do an entire show about Star Force and how insane those are.
It's a handy little purview of history, which nobody seems to know or care about, because we got this little overview of history all through school. And we assumed, like I said in the beginning, that everything's been discovered and there's no more exploration to do. History's all been figured out and it's a dead subject. And if you're interested in history, the History Channel has 47 specials on World War II. And that's it.
We are at the point now where I believe that the next step is to start crowdfunding research and talking to scientists and coming up with ways and strategies of how we can actually start testing these theories, soil core samples, potentially dating the age of rocks and quarries and rocks and buildings.